Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Dandelion Dynasty, Book 4, Speaking Bones, Chapters 53 and 54, Persuasion and Truth. In these chapters, I am really curious what everyone else's reaction to these chapters was. Because I've got to be honest, kiddos, I feel like I didn't take away what Ken Liu kind of wanted me to take away. Am I alone? Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Kyle for commissioning this episode. Kyle's here in the chat. Howdy, Kyle. He says howdy. So yeah, you guys, these two chapters are focused on the thesis of the book, I would say, on recovering everything that Gia has done and the reasons why, and on stating that Phyro was not ready to rule and that it is really for the best that he not be made king or emperor, in a way that felt very decisive, and which I, as you guys know from listening to the show, don't fully agree with. And it's interesting to see that something I felt was sort of being left up to our own judgment as readers it seems to me, very distinctly told as these are the people in the right and these were the people in the wrong, in a way that I hadn't anticipated and I'm not sure I really like. I just didn't expect Ken Liu to sort of stand in front of me as an author and say, these things that I showed you mean this, which means he would have been a bad ruler. And that feels like what's happening with Fara. And the whole thing with Gia and the grace given to her by Kogoyelu, it feels like I am meant to really, step back from her and see, everything and I know this already. It felt like we were told all of these things that it's clear that was what was going on. I didn't really need a summary of it all from Kogoyelu. I got it. But I don't believe these were the best or only course of action either. And I am just really taken aback at how much of a side Ken Liu seems to be taking. I didn't really see what he was writing as having a correct answer. I felt like the point was they each think they're approaching things the right way, and they are each right and wrong, and in their own way. And it doesn't seem like that's what he meant for me to be getting out of it, which is a shame, because I just am not buying the conclusions that he is coming to the way that I think he intended me to. And I really am super curious if anyone else felt the same way when they got to this part. There have been a lot of moments throughout where Phyro has proven that he is impetuous, that he does still think of things as being in a storybook. And to me, you can have those qualities and grow past them and see the reality. And I know that that's sort of part of the conversation that Fara winds up having with Zomi, and is really regretfully being like, and we'll never know if he could have grown out of it, like, you know. But it seemed to me like we were seeing his growth in real time, and then he's dead, and all of that growth is just sort of discounted as too recent to be taken seriously. And it kind of bugs me. Like, I don't know. I think that really what it comes down to is that I don't like being told that this is the right opinion and this is the wrong one in a series that so far has seemed to be really nuanced, and to be willing to step back and let me make my own decisions in the moment about whether I think something was a good call or not. And even with like what happened with Kuniguru betraying Matazindu, the betrayal was historically seen as a necessary evil, as something that was like the right call ultimately for the good of the people, even though it was without honor, even though it was underhanded, some people would say. And as much as I was told like this was the right call for him, the way it was written, I felt like I was given enough room between people talking about it in the past tense in a positive light and it happening, that I was sort of able to come to my own conclusion in the interim and see that, yeah, I think really he did sort of have to do it this way, but it is shocking. So that once they were talking about him, I appreciated that they had that sort of like compassion for his position. But this is so soon after everything that I haven't, like, Gia's only just barely been able to like wrap up her scheme, and it doesn't feel like I was given that space. Kyle says, I mean, that's not what I personally got from it, but I'll admit I was much less invested in Phyro as a character. What you got from it was not that you're being told who's right and who's wrong. I just want to make sure that I understand what you're saying. And feel free, Kyle, tell me what you did get, because I'm like, I think that maybe my reaction is indeed that I was invested in Phyro, and I understood what he was struggling with in terms of somebody who sees things through the lens of like honor and stories and things being a little bit too black and white. I can certainly be that way. So maybe there's a part of me that feels a bit called out personally. But I just did seem to see growth on his part in many ways. And while, yeah, he fell into the trap that Gia set for him because he did what she predicted he would do, which sucks, I also could see there being a lesson in that he could have learned if he were given the chance. And granted, he's the one who drew the line in the sand and opted for suicide. So, you know, that's on him to a point. But it was really just like, it felt like in the room when they talked about what could have been, she drew the exact same conclusions as Fara does in the conversation with Zomi, and they were just not the conclusions that I had come to. And maybe this just means that I would not be a good ruler, which I am willing to believe, because I don't feel like I would. But let's start with 53. So Lady Soto and Zomi are together, and they wind up splitting up. Zomi comes in to speak to Fara, and Soto goes on to speak with Gia a little bit later on. And Zomi felt something rough in the otherwise smooth mirror-like surface of the door frame. She lifted her fingers and looked closer. Carved into the wooden frame was the drawing of a young woman, clearly done with a writing knife wielded by a childish hand. Under the drawing was an inscription in neat Zindari letters in word squares, slanted at an audacious angle. Kikomi was wronged. The face of Thera resurfaced in her mind, passionately explaining to her how the Amu princess had been misunderstood. And this hints at what the conclusion is that Kogoyelu is sharing later on with Gia, because he says that Zomi has come to the same conclusion. And it makes sense that after Thera has pointed this particular story and the way it's told, points it out, that would have wormed its way into Zomi's mind as maybe certain people play things to just look away, and they're willing to take the historical bullet for the sake of everybody in the short term or in the long term. So Gia is waiting for Soto, and I had forgotten about how she has these weird little fans that are triggered by air movement so that she knows when people are coming down the hallway. And then we go back to Zomi, and this was something that I found a little tricky while I was reading, the jumping back and forth between these two conversations, because in the print version where you're actually turning pages, this is probably demarcated in a way that's a little bit more obvious, but the way that it's broken up in the Kindle depends on how big the font is that you've chosen and what font, and just all of that affects how much is on the page. And so if you have it in such a way that the little single slash mark falls at the very bottom or very top, it's really easy to miss that you're starting in a new section with the other characters. So I found myself constantly having to stop and be like, wait, what? Oh, we're in the other room now. And I had to kind of go back a little bit a couple times and get a handle on who was talking and where they were, because I was getting confused. Especially because Soto and Zomi are together initially, and the way that Gia pops up out of nowhere, it was just a little bit confusing. But that's their conversations are meant to play off one another. We have a revelation here that I appreciated, and that Zomi also is oh, I didn't know this, about how close Phyro and Fara were. And that he was basically somebody who had her back and supported her all the time. He would do the voices of the characters with me. He always wanted to be the wise Dairon, even though I told him wise Dairons were women. Zomi chuckled. He did like to fight with your sister over who got to play the better parts. Do you remember during a palace examination when some scholars put on a show with monsters like Kruben wolves? And in this vein, the two shared memories of Phyro Garu from his days as a mischievous schoolboy, worshipful of his older sister and always competing with his older brother, to his boastful and boisterous time as a young prince dreaming of the romance of honor and martial glory, then to his turbulent reign as emperor only in name, seething under the thumb of his aunt mother's regency, followed by his transformation into a brilliant general, stunning the Liuku with guile as well as strength, until finally his bold rebellion against Gia falling short of achieving his goal literally by one step. Fara's grief was so intense and overwhelming that Zomi despaired of her mission, yet she had to go on. He was the emperor Dara deserved, but didn't get. No, said Fara after a pause. He would not have been a good emperor. Zomi looked over at her, and she thinks Perhaps there is hope after all. And that was the moment where I was kind of like, oh, I guess I have been meant to think that he wouldn't be a good emperor. But I wasn't thinking that. And maybe this is just me not really seeing clearly, you know? I'm willing to admit that. He did, do a lot of the things that he was predicted to do because of his preoccupation with a certain type of oversimplified justice and balance. I just feel like that, I don't know. I keep saying I didn't feel like that was all, that it was as strong, but he literally died coming at Gia in her palace in the exact way she expected him to. Not in the exact way in terms of the style, like coming in disguise and all of that, but you know what I'm saying? Like, she had a trap, a very literal trap in the floor for him to fall into because she knew he was going to walk into the room. So I keep hanging on to but I feel like he was growing, even though his last act was to do the thing that she had sort of predicted he would do. The thing that keeps getting me sort of tripped up is that she had expected him to raise an army and fully attack the capital, when he doesn't do that. He creates an illusion to make it seem like they're attacking the capital, and a distraction with a certain group of people set up in a certain area so that there is a semblance of what seems to be like an invasion. So I felt like that was pretty good judgment on his part, that he knew Gia would likely expect a particular type of assault. And while he was coming after her personally, he wasn't willing to throw away the lives of tons of innocent people for the sake of his own, what's the word I want? Vengeance is not strong enough, but I guess that's what I'll go with. I felt like that was restrained, and that showed he actually had better judgment than she was willing to grant him. But at the same time, he insisted on being the one to face her and putting himself, the actual, the potential future ruler, in personal peril, which is immature and is storybook and is short-sighted. So I just keep going back and forth, Kyle says, so personally, I was on the same page as Fara and Zomi. I never thought he was going to be the guy, but the tragedy of it was that he was much closer to being the guy than anyone anticipated. Okay, I see what you mean. That, potentially he could have been, but he was insisting too soon and wound up destroying himself and any potential for growth. Okay, I could see that. Do you guys hear me? I stand by feeling like I'm being told a thing that I hadn't reached that conclusion. But when I step back and look at the way he was behaving, I can see in places why this is exactly what I said he was going to do, and it would be really disappointing. I just keep getting tripped up. For example, and I mentioned this last episode also, that Gia dismissed completely the concept of coming to any sort of agreement with the Liuku. And Fara even mentions this herself. He yearned to be like the hegemon in honor, and she talks a lot about how he wanted to embody the best of all of these like incredible legends and historical figures, but he didn't want to admit the dark side of any of those people, that they were not perfect, that the ideals he was saying they strove for were not all that they strove for. And he wouldn't look at the fact that the hegemon was really, really cruel, that Gin Mazzotti had such pride that maybe things wouldn't have gone the way they did if not for that, you know, like, which I think is true. His failing was a reluctance to accept imperfections and shades of gray. The world for him was black and white, like one of my knitting patterns. Again, almost. He was once willing to let 9 out of 10 die in Rui and Dasu, so long as he liberated the conquered islands. He was once willing to grant mercy to all the Liuku, so long as they surrendered to him with honor. And the grant mercy to all the Liuku was the exact thing that Gia had said. I can't, like, the very fact that he said he reached an agreement with Gin Mazzotti means that he's not ready. I was relieved that later on, Kogoyelu calls Gia out, because she's doing the exact same thing, talking about how we need to fucking eradicate them because that's what they want to do to us. And he's like, whoa, you are not hearing yourself. They are fucking people. They're not all good or all bad any more than we are. Because I was kind of surprised at the fact that Fara dismissed his willingness to grant mercy to them as a flaw, a fault in him. When I found that whole exchange and the fight with I keep wanting to say Gin Mazzotti, with Goztan, I found that to be like really moving. The fact that this was an enemy that he hated with such a passion. And then he met somebody that proved to be different than what he was expecting from that group of people, and revised his assessment a little bit. To me, that does show that he was willing to see shades of gray, and they aren't. You know what I'm saying? So it was just sort of weird, because I felt like he was, some of the things that he did that were in exactly the line of thinking that they wanted were the exact things they pointed out as being evidence that he wasn't thinking clearly. And I'm just like, that was a good thing. What do you mean? Like, you know? So anyway, this was just it was a weird conversation for me to read, because I just was not of the same opinion on so many things. There were certainly, I understood where she was coming from on a lot of it, but she was coming to a different conclusion based on the same information in such a way that I felt really like disconnected, because I was like, wait, she's drawing what conclusion? Like, I just kept being surprised by this. He risked everything, including his life and the stability of Dara, so long as he could avenge Empress Rosanna with his own hands. True. I would, like, that's 100%. But he also wasn't willing to throw all of these lives away in a pitched invasion, which is what Gia had expected him to do. Which to me shows growth. And then Zomi. But he was also able to grow and change. He gave up on the invasion of unredeemed Dara at the last moment on his own, out of concern for the people who would have been harmed. I do not think he could have resheathed the sword of righteous rage had I been in his place. Was that not wisdom? Fara broke down in deep, heaving sobs. That is the grandest tragedy of all. He could have been, would have been, should have been, but he wasn't. We'll never know how his nature could have grown, how he would have nurtured his wisdom. Though I love my brother dearly, I'm glad he was never trusted with the seal of Dara during his lifetime. My heart breaks because in the end he could not live the life he wanted and deserved to live, but was reduced to a caricature of vengeance and all-consuming hate. He lived up to the story he wanted others to tell about him, instead of a story that was true to his soul. And this raises a really interesting question. If you do just what someone expects you to do, but you are doing it in response to a number of targeted manipulations by that person, is it still completely on you that, like, they pulled your strings in certain ways? And I believe it is. When it comes down to it, you make your own choices. It's just really hard for me to stomach somebody being blamed for behaving in a certain way when you did everything you could to lay the groundwork for them to react the way they are reacting. You know what I'm saying? And, like, ultimately, I know it doesn't even matter whether or not, either way, what happened. It doesn't change anything. And he's a grown man, and if he isn't to be held responsible for his own actions, how the fuck is he supposed to be emperor? So this isn't really me in defense of Phyro, so much as, like, thinking about the many ways that I, for instance, could be very easily set up. And I wish that he hadn't chosen to detonate that bomb, because I can't help but wonder if being captured and Gia telling him, I knew exactly what you were going to do because you are really predictable and you always think XYZ, and you have nobody but yourself to blame for being caught now. Would that have done anything? And obviously, coming from Gia, the woman who killed his mother, it wouldn't. It would likely have had to come from Fara. If Gia had abdicated, kept Phyro alive, but not told anybody he was still alive, and Fara comes into rule and finds out he's imprisoned and speaks with him about this, would he internalize this lesson, or would he simply be so overwhelmed with hatred for Gia that nothing could penetrate? He seemed open enough when he was talking to Gia in his last moments that I couldn't help but feel like it might seep in. It might do something. And this is, again, not a question that matters, but I am really curious because the potential of Phyro, I'm just so devastated. And what it is that Gia has done, while ultimately she has saved them from outright warfare, what happened as a result of the things that she did was so hideous sometimes that I'm not sure what she saved them from was worse than what they wound up with. So we'll get there in a moment. Gia goes back and forth with Soto, and I'm not going to go through their whole conversation. All I'm going to say is that Soto wants Gia to tell her the real reason that she did the things that she did. Because Soto is smart enough to see now that she was being manipulated, that Gia pretended she was going to poison her so that she would run off and tell Phyro like the whole thing was a plan. Gia, though, is not willing to tell about her plotting. As far as she is concerned, any revelation of what she intended throughout all of this will just muddy the waters. She is completely willing to go down as a villain as long as everything is left in its place the way she meant it to be, which is remarkable, you know. And I am just going to completely cop to the fact that, like, I had a very strong reaction to Kikomi's story and how willingly she opted into being seen as a cowardly, like, flighty, silly woman, when I don't know if my pride would have allowed that. The thing about Gia, and this really says a lot about me, the thing about Gia is that she would be remembered as a villain, yes, and be remembered as somebody who held onto power and had, like, a sort of lustful, ambitious personality. But she'd also be remembered for being fucking smart. And I can deal with being seen as a bad person a lot more easily than I can deal with being seen as a stupid person. And I know that's kind of fucked up. I cop to that 100%. But there is some dignity, in a weird way, in the mask that Gia has been wearing versus the one that Kikomi took on, where she was going to embody all of the worst stereotypes about silly young women. And that would gall me. Like, I would just, you know, Gia at least has this strength to her that I think everybody understood and respected to a point. And so the vibe of that is so different that you can hear in my voice, I'm not giving her the same kind of credit that I was giving Kikomi. Even though, when it comes down to it, they're both doing the same thing. So that's on me. I'm just gonna say. So we go back to Zomi and Fara, and really what we find out here is that the suspicion that Gia is somehow responsible for the Toliusa thirst is really widely held, which I am desperately curious where this has originated. Like, the way, let's see, Tanbanaki's passing has resulted in a new leadership, and the Liku are beset by a plague that has killed some of their warriors. It's more like a poison, but they're unwilling to go into details. They blame it on the Empress. I want to know how they have that, like, connection at all. Where are they making this sort of leap in logic? I don't know why they think this. Whether their belief in an antidote is reasonable, the prospect for reunification and the surrender of the Liuku cannot be ignored. Since the throne remains empty, the Inner Council has appointed Gori Ruthi as a chief negotiator. Some advocate lying to the Liuku about an antidote, accepting their surrender, then slaughtering them to avenge their victims. Others argue we should tell them the truth and see if we can nonetheless work out a new peace treaty. Some others want to investigate this poison and see if we can work out a cure, and others suggest we drag out the negotiations to gain maximum advantage. And all of this is with the hopes of basically pushing Fara into agreeing to become Empress. Zomi is aware she has to choose to do this. She can't be, like, forced. But it's a lot of really heavy-handed manipulation, the way that she's talking to her. And Fara just keeps responding with, like, I don't know. I don't feel confident in any answer. I'm not ambitious. I don't want the throne. And Zomi being like, yeah, I know. That's my point. And Fara is just like, ugh, a test. So, again, go back to Gia and Soto. And she talks about how the truth doesn't matter to history. You know, only fragments suit the purpose of the moment. I know what I've done. I know why and how, and that's enough. So, Fara says, the Liuku demand an antidote to the poison before they'll permit shipments of aid. Do we devote our resources to saving torturers, enslavers, killers? Or no, sorry, this is Zomi saying this. Or do we refuse and watch as unredeemed Dara starves? What shall we do with liberated islands? Those free from enslavement will demand retribution. How will we channel their righteous rage? Some of the Liuku were responsible for the torture and slaughter of tens of thousands. What of the collaborators? Should they be tried? Others genuinely believe collaboration was the only way to save lives. How do we tell them apart? And Fara just starts yelling, stop asking me. And Zomi says, Emperor Ragan and Empress Gia have left us a sturdy ship, a system that can weather the storm, but no system, no matter how perfectly designed, can sustain itself for long without the animating spirit of a constitutive story that feels true. The most important choices in life are not made by logic, by the tallying of pros and cons, by measuring and weighing, by naming and mapping, but by yielding to the eternal yearnings of the heart and renewing the foundational myth of our mortal condition. This is as true of individuals as peoples. That's been underlined by a lot of people, according to my Kindle. What Dara needs now is not the doubt ender, but the emptiness of doubtful potential. When the bitter core of the lotus seed has been removed, it's ready for all the flavors of the world. When the old worlds in Gitra Uthu had been washed away by the sea, new stories may be written upon the blank pages. Doubt gives rise to humility, and humility leads to empathy. It's empathy more than anything else at this moment that we need. To be born to the house of Dandelion may be a curse rather than a blessing. But we cannot force you to take up this burden. You must do so willingly. And Fara is just looking back at her life and the way that she has lived the opposite kind of life that she will live if she becomes empress. And she has loved it, and now she's being asked to give up everything that has brought her to life kind of over the past several years. And she's reflecting on how many of the people that she cared about are dead after everything. They died believing they were fighting for more of that love that she could never get enough of, the love that enlarged the soul, the love that made the world real. The people of Dara was no longer an abstraction to her, and Mutaje no longer an indefinite word. She could not avert her face from the horrors of the world. And she nodded, and Zomi bows and calls her empress. We go back to Soto and Gia just straight up refuses to give an inch. And it seems like that's going to be the end of her being asked to tell her side of the story. But we get the Kogoyelu thing later on. So then we have chapter 54, Truth. And there is a walled compound here. This is really, really rough, you guys. The Liuku are being kept here, as well as Diana, the granddaughter of Gia, which every time they mention her grandchildren, I'm like, what? And then I realize, oh yeah, they just seem so divorced from Gia that I forget they're related, you know? And this was absolutely heartbreaking, you guys. Toju, who suffered from Toleusa thirst, I was under the impression that eventually one could recover from Toleusa thirst naturally, that there was a detoxification period and that there would always be a strong desire, but that there would come a point where you would have worked it out of your system enough that the thirst would not be overwhelming and would not be what determined your actions. But it seems like the addictive qualities of this are a lot more intense than I realized. And he has not forgiven Diana. He has, and forgiven her, like, I say forgiven in quotes because she hasn't done anything wrong. Like, the only thing that could be perceived as her doing wrong is taking his place as the head of the tribe. But he had begun to lose his head before that decision was made. This is the addiction, and he is calling her a traitor and saying he's going to kill her. And they have attempted to see Gia, and she refuses to see him. He is Prince Timu's child, your flesh and blood. He is the spitting image of Tototika at that age. What good will seeing him do? I know nothing of what ails the child. The Liuku suffer a plague from the gods. No mortal hands can stop that. And I really thought it was interesting that Rocky at this point seems to have taken it for granted that Gia can indeed solve this problem. She doubts Gia, which Gia likes. She sees the doubt and is like, oh, good. She is not mindlessly loyal to me. But she isn't ever going to have confirmation that I was responsible. And it's interesting because as much as Gia doesn't want anyone to know what her machinations were all about, and a lot of that is about preserving I'm going to be honest, you guys. A part of me felt like it was unnecessary that she sacrifice her legacy and not tell anybody. I think that her idea here is that the Liuku all do need to be eradicated. The Toleusa thirst needs to take its course and kill all of them. And nobody can know she was responsible for it because it has to be seen as like a miracle and work of the gods, like a judgment, right? But I can't help but think she could have taken credit for this, and I don't know how much that would have affected her legacy, considering how much of a villain she was already being painted to be, and how strong the suspicion already was. It seems like she cops to it in the end, because she is writing this, you know, but I don't know totally why she feels the need to go down with the ship the way she is. So she is like really struggling with this internally and knowing that she's essentially sentencing her grandson to death. And all of a sudden we find out that the building where he was being housed has gone up in flames. And Toju, it's assumed, freed himself and started a fire because he was swearing that they are going to, like, you know, that he's going to kill them all. Diana says she did this. She did all this about Gia. And I was sort of wondering if Gia did do this, like, you know, I was wondering whether she didn't want to see him suffering, like hearing about it was too terrible and she didn't know how long it was going to go on. So she decided to take matters into her own hands. I don't know what kind of influence Gia has at this point, because the Dyrenfins would have done this, but they're gone. You know, so I don't know. So let's see. This is when Kogoyelu comes to see Gia. And he tells her Toju has died. And she tries to hold herself up, but she finally just slumps. Empress Shizona, which is what Fara is going by now, and I really want to know where they get these names. Where do they pick their new names? I want to know. She's demanding that you produce the antidote for Tolyusa thirst. And she is continuing to deny that there is an antidote. But later, Koko just gives her a look, and she realizes that he knows. So he tells her this whole thing is about him putting together the story of what was really going on by looking at a lot of the different records in the household and who was around because of who was being fed, where like certain personnel was. And he has figured out a lot of what she was up to and can tell that much of what she has left behind to implicate herself, like with the deaths of all the Dyrenfins, it was sloppy, really sloppy, compared to how absolutely immaculate like a lot of the rest of the room was in one situation, or how many witnesses were left for a certain thing. And like, they even are able to tell that the Dyrenfins had been dead a couple days by the time the whole coup went down. So her acting like, oh, I tried to call them, but they wouldn't do it, so I killed them. That timeline doesn't make any sense. And he tricks her a little bit into saying, he says, someone had anticipated the rebellion of the ministers and killed the Dyrenfins ahead of time to make sure our coup would succeed with minimal resistance and loss of lives. You wrong them. They were good girls and they deserve to be remembered as heroes of the revolution. And he's like, that's it. What you were doing was keeping them from stopping the revolution, but you didn't want them to be remembered that way because you want people to make, offerings to them and keep their names alive. So you pretended they were helping the revolution and had to be killed because you're so terrible and you had to just have your vengeance. And she's like, why would I kill the only people who could help me stay in power? And he's like, because you didn't want to stay in power. This is very simple. I feel like I've said this already. And I love how often she keeps trying to come up with excuses or just be like, whatever, that's a coincidence. It doesn't matter. I was just careless. And he's like, no. And this is when he talks about like the kitchen records and being able to tell that the Dyrenfins were the ones who were traveling with certain shipments and things like that. And that Huto was taking really careful notes about his interactions with them. So she realizes that like there's enough here, even though you could say it's circumstantial, it is compelling. And he even finds the spot where the Tolyusa was being bred. And she's like, you're just coming up with conspiracies. And he's like, some conspiracies are true. So let me tell you a little story. There's a woman who is like unexpectedly thrust into the position of becoming empress and is intending to like guide Dara through a new era of peace. And then all of a sudden, this fleet comes and unleashes such hideous violence that she has got to do something that she never expected to have to do again. Like many others, she endured pain and loss. Her husband died, as did her most valiant war duke. Her son became a captive. Her daughter departed Dara. In the end, a fragile stalemate was achieved with the islands partitioned in halves. One half was the dominion of the invaders, who desired nothing less than the annihilation of the native population. On the other hand, Gia found herself in charge of the charred remains, teetering on the precipice of collapse. Voices called out for war, vengeance, salvation. How could their demands be denied? But Gia also knew that fighting the Liuku meant certain death for the captive population. Total war had a logic of its own, and a people consumed by war became more like their enemies. That way lay the madness of militarism, the desolation of deaths by the millions, and finally the terror of tyranny justified by the thirst for conquest. And this is like, when Dara was fighting back against the Liuku initially, they were not doing well. The Garinnafins were absolutely slaughtering them. And then there's the captive population. Like, she was trying to navigate an impossible situation. So one half of her would become the fabled patternist patron who boosted innovation and invention, the ideal moralist sovereign who reified virtues through rituals. The other half would work in darkness, plotting and scheming, conspiring and misdirecting. She turned to the art of cultivation. She removed Empress Rosanna and let those believe she was selfish, a craven, a coward. While free Dara grew stronger under the peace of the Regency, in the conquered lands the invaders grew indolent and indulged in misrule. Appetite, when indulged excessively, mutated into addiction. Just as the invaders had come to rely on shipments of tribute, they also came to rely on shipments of enhanced Zomi berries. She kept the plot to herself. To perfect the addictive strain, she had to experiment upon live prisoners. Most horrifying of all, to deliver the greater portion of mercy, she had to prevent the Liuku from grafting themselves onto the rootstock of Dara, forestall them from budding onto the bough of the people of the islands, block them from building an efficient machinery of state that would permanently enslave native invention, knowledge, and skill in the service of Liuku supremacy. That meant she had to undermine the accommodationists and prop up the hardliners, leave the captive population of the conquered islands in unspeakable suffering. And that I found really interesting. I wasn't picking up that was the concern that she had, is basically like, if the accommodationists, who are the ones that were tolerant of the Dara people and wanting to embrace some of their traditions, their intelligence, their technology, that they would simply use it against Dara, and that would be considered like an abomination by her. And it makes sense that she would see this in this way. It's just that I was looking at such a short-term view of like, yeah, but that means people are going to be fucking tortured. And she knew that, but ultimately felt like it was worth it. And that is something that I can't agree with, because that, as much as I can see how she feared that it was going to result in, well, we're just using this against you to continue to like enslave your people, I feel like that is the path to eventually being able to like coexist. But Gia simply does not believe coexisting with the Ryuku is an option at all. And so her complete black and white view on that resulted in propping up those who did things so hideous and unimaginable, which she later says to Kogo that like the Toyusa madness caused them to wreak such havoc that she could never have even come up with. I don't feel like that worked out, girl. You know, I can understand what you thought you were doing, but it really wasn't how that shook out. So then in the end, she distracted observers by sullying her own name, you know, yada, yada, yada. Her dream had always been to create a Dara in which it didn't matter who was the sovereign. Only a system could secure the happiness of the people beyond mortal span. But her plan required her to carry out hidden designs beyond the reach of the law, to maintain a secret military force not subject to civilian oversight, to hold on to power without the constraints of legitimacy, consensus, the institutions that channeled power. So she embarked upon a second parallel plan, cultivating, pruning, shaping, training the living machinery of the state. And I'm running out of time, so I can't go through all of this. But she put everybody in place so that she could be taken out of power in a completely bloodless coup, which is like pretty much miraculous, as he points out. She had succeeded, but was also exhausted. The weight of years of plotting against an implacable foe strained her heart. The guilt of cruel acts against the innocent victims stained her conscience. She was glad that the self-regulating, self-correcting machinery of state that she had worked so hard to build was finally strong enough to constrain the power of the sovereign, ready to challenge herself. So at this point, Gia is crying. And I really like the fact that earlier she was thinking to herself, I'm trying so hard to tell him this isn't what's going on. And yet a part of me desperately wants him to understand what I was really trying to do. And I cannot reconcile how much I don't want him to pick up on what's happening with how much I desperately want him to get it. And she, in this moment, is so gratified to have been seen. And she's still trying to do, well, that's just a story, you know. But he knows that he fucking nailed it. And then he says, it was in the end a staged performance. The bloodless revolution is a lie. To which she's like, it's always a lie. It's politics. But he says, I've already resigned. And she's like, what the fuck? Why? Because I knew your case against Gin was fabricated, but backed you anyway. Because I suspected you had murdered Rosanna, but did not act on my suspicion. Because I turned a blind eye to your schemes until Phyro died. I was your accomplice, even if I didn't know. Phyro killed himself. I wanted to stop him. I tried. I understand. I know that you wanted to keep me and the other members from the price of such a victory. But we were all complicit. None of us was clean. I've grown old and less cynical. A more just future cannot be built upon a foundation of lies. And she says, how do you think my granddaughter and her thanes will react when they receive confirmation their suspicions were true about the Toyusa? You did what you had to avert a fate worse for millions. You have too much trust in the common people. The truth will make them lose faith. And you trust them too little. You want to construct a system of interlocking institutions that will serve the people, but a system is nothing unless it is reconstituted act after act. You think you see far, but no individual can see as far as the compounded eyes of their children and their children. The people must be allowed to see for themselves and chart their own course, to tell their own story. Let the people have their truth. There's one more thing. Empress Shizona is negotiating the terms of the Ryukyu surrender. They have one demand: a cure. And finally, she admits that she does indeed have it. The surrendered Ryukyu will also be the people of Dara. The Ryukyu can never become the people of Dara. This was exactly what she had feared Phyro would do. Do not undo all I have done. You speak like Kutan Rovo, said Koko. Gia felt as though she had been slapped in the face. How can we dismiss an entire people in one judgment? And thank you. Thank you, Koko. This has gone on too long without anybody kind of stopping her and being like, bitch, do you hear yourself? And I get it. She has reason to hate them, but so do a lot of people who have managed to look past it, including, by the way, Phyro himself. Just throwing that out there. Fara has chosen mercy over justice. She wishes that her nephew will be the last to die instead of one of the first. And mercy over justice is something that I aspire to be okay with. I'm fine with it in this context because I've gotten to know a lot of the Ryukyu and understand. But I strive to be okay with it in a context when I don't know the other side of things. I think that's kind of the point, is mercy matters when you can't be sure. You know, that's really when it counts as something, because it's a risk. That's what it is. And it's just not something I'm good with, man. I like a sure thing. I really do. And she kind of dissolves into tears here, thinking about how much she failed Timu, because she keeps seeing his face when she imagines Toju, who died. And she's just like, man, I don't know how you managed to completely see through all of this, but I can't sleep. I can't close my eyes. And he's like, yeah, I get it. And this is part of what I mean, that it's time for us to step aside. It's a new generation. And, you've planted a tree. But that's the nature of it. You plant it, but you don't live long enough to sit under it. That's for somebody else down the line, and you know that when you do it. And that's the beauty. And it's also the difficulty. And you have to just let go of this hope that you can see the future and what's going to happen, and design any sort of system that's just completely impervious to things going wrong or corruption. You can't. You've done your best, and you have got to have faith in other people and future generations. A long line of figures larger than life seemed to parade before her. Friends, foes, lovers who had passed beyond the river on which nothing floats. She couldn't tell if their expressions were of forgiveness or hatred, compassion or enmity. No matter how much she strained, their faces refused to resolve into clarity. They simply beckoned at her, asking her to see herself as flawed, merely mortal, but one of the people of Dara. How did you know I would have a cure? You're an herbalist, Gia. A healer. It's in your nature never to design a poison without an antidote. She nodded and composed herself. Let the Empress know that I'm at her service. I submit to the judgment of the present. And full disclosure, guys, when I was listening to the audiobook, I over-listened into the first paragraph of the next chapter by accident. And I found out that Gia is writing one of these books. That's going to be... So, like, evidently she's telling all, which is wild. Like, she was so sure that she had to hold on to all of this forever. And she's just completely reversed. And I'm glad. I appreciated her willingness to go down as a villain, although I didn't fully see the need for it. But I'm glad that it's not wrapping that way, you know? Even though I'm still not totally sure I agree. I feel like Phyro needed to have been given more of a chance. And he just got pushed around and manipulated so much from such a young age that he really, I don't know, it just feels unfair. But I guess that's sort of the tragedy of it, as Kyle said. So anyway, all right, guys, I've got to wrap. Thank you again so much for hanging out with me. Thank you, Kyle, for commissioning these. Appreciate everybody's perspectives. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.